So one of the earliest and first Steam Deck videos that I made on this channel was talking about just how great playing old games on the Steam Deck is. Not necessarily retro titles like firing up like an NES game through an emulator or something like that, but rather I'm talking about older games that came out in the mid-2000s or early 2010s, for example. There are just a ton of games from that era that not only hold up really well from a gameplay perspective, but also perform exceptionally well on the Steam Deck where it can maintain 60 FPS without breaking a sweat. Which makes perfect sense, right? Because the technology is a little bit older at this point. But nonetheless, because the gameplay on those titles holds up so well, I decided to go ahead and highlight some of the games that I've been driving into that were a little bit older, but ultimately still a whole lot of fun. So today's video is basically a continuation of that, where I just wanted to talk about a few more older titles that I've been playing on the Steam Deck that play really well and, again, have managed to stand the test of time despite the fact that they are getting way long in the tooth at this point. And the first one that I want to start with is a game that I beat way back in 2003 on the original Xbox, and that is Max Payne 2. And even for being almost 20 years old, it still holds up really well. Sure, the environmental design can feel a little bit dated maybe, but artistically the whole thing is still a whole lot of fun as long as you don't mind some of the most melodramatic, over-the-top detective noir dialogue that you've probably ever heard in a video game. Admittedly, the controls threw me off a bit as I tried to readjust for the PC version since, again, I was familiar with the original Xbox version and the console experience of Max Payne 2. But after adjusting the mouse sensitivity a little bit so that camera control with the right analog stick felt a little bit more like what I was used to, it was perfectly serviceable from a control perspective. And I chose this one because I have really fond memories of playing through the original Max Payne and Max Payne 2. Tragically, I never beat Max Payne 3, however I feel like this might be a good opportunity for me to finally go back and revisit the trilogy, not just because it's fun in its own right and it pioneered a lot of really fun mechanics like the slow motion bullet time that it's known for, but also we are getting a remake of Max Payne and I believe Max Payne 2 as well sometime in the next year or two, so now seems like a good time to go back and revisit Max's original storylines from those first two games and for me, finally beat the third game and ultimately kind of see how far it's evolved because as much as I enjoy it, going back again, it does feel a little bit dated and I can see why they chose to do a remake and an update of this game because frankly it feels like it's overdue and Max Payne is just too beloved of a character and too iconic of an original franchise for what it accomplished at the time to just leave it rotting away somewhere. I'm so glad that they're remaking this and I'm so glad that I can revisit it so easily and at a bargain price at a buttery smooth 60 frames per second on the Steam Deck. Now moving forward in time just a little bit to another shooter that featured some slow motion elements, although crucially with a horror twist, would be Fear. And like Max Payne before it, I also experienced this on the Xbox, however it was on the Xbox 360. And this is one that I don't think I ever actually got around to beating, so it was kind of fun to revisit this and try to see what exactly I remembered from that original 360 experience. True to other horror games that I've played on the Steam Deck, there is a creeping, well, fear, I guess, which would be appropriate, that maybe a jump scare is going to cause me to absolutely just like chuck this thing across the room accidentally. Maybe that's not realistic. However, there have definitely been a few jump scares that I've gotten from horror games so far that have made me a little bit concerned because, again, I'm not in a hurry to chuck a $400 PC across the room, but assuming you can quell that fear response that comes from any jump moments that will definitely arise from the fear experience, it plays just as smoothly as Max Payne does with a solid 60 frames per second, which, again, is predictably true for most of the games on this list. And like Max Payne, despite the fact that it does have a supernatural element, it really does have a grittier, more grounded feel to it, and the guns in particular feel really punchy in Fear, and I had forgotten how good it feels to just fire even the basic pistol in this game. But what really jumped out at me the most, aside from the inevitable jump scares that I already mentioned, is just how refined the enemy AI is in this game, and I would say even pitted against a lot of modern games, it can put enemy AI to shame. It's kind of crazy to me that a game that is this old featured enemy behaviors that are this refined. They're not just going to sit there and be bullet sponges for you, but rather they will work together in teams and strategize about the best way to deal with you. Whether that means flanking you, or laying down ambushes for you, or retreating, often in very intelligent ways. I was honestly just a little bit shocked at just how capably these enemies were responding to my movements and tactics, and I ended up dying more than a few times, so it really doesn't benefit you to go in completely guns blazing in this game. Or at least it didn't benefit me because I got absolutely rocked. However, I will say the slow motion functionality does help out just a little bit if you get in a jam. And I think that's really great because I think the difficulty really does find that perfect kind of Goldilocks sweet spot where it's challenging enough that it's not going to be a cakewalk, but it's not so over-the-top daunting that you're going to walk away from it frustrated and just not want to play Fear anymore. But if you're the kind of gamer who appreciates a good jump scare or that horrifying feeling of dread in your stomach as you never quite know what's around the next corner, Fear will give you that in droves, and it is, again, an entirely capable experience on the Steam Deck. Now, if you wanted to dive into an older title that is also horror-based, along with some stealth action that had no small amount of controversy when it came out, then you should check out Manhunt on the Steam Deck. Now, Manhunt originally dropped way back in 2003 on the PlayStation 2, and while I think it's a game that would also benefit from a modern-day remake, I honestly don't think it's ever going to get one because even by today's standards, Manhunt is some pretty disturbing stuff. Don't get me wrong, if you like horror and extremely dark subject matter, Manhunt absolutely fits the bill well. But as stealth action games go, I have to say that Manhunt's approach by today's standards feels a little bit simplistic, and really I think the primary draw are the over-the-top executions that you can perform, which aren't quite as rewarding as pulling off something like a fatality in a Mortal Kombat game or anything like that. But since it requires patience and planning to get the most grisly over-the-top murder animations, it is at least somewhat rewarding. I won't say a whole lot about what the story entails if you've never experienced Manhunt before, but if you can find it at a bargain price, I still think it's worth playing today, but probably only once. Now, this would not be the strongest recommendation that I have on this list or anything, and to be fair, revisiting it in 2022 is fun, but at the same time, there are better stealth action and better horror experiences out there at this point. But if you're like me and you're just looking for a quick hit of nostalgia from a stealth action game that had an admittedly twisted sort of twist on the genre at the time, and you have the constitution to really stomach all the horrifying things you'll be doing as Cash throughout its length, then yeah, Manhunt might be worth revisiting. And while we're on the subject of perhaps better horror experiences, and certainly more modern, not true modern, but rather like 2012 modern, the next game on this list would be Resident Evil Revelations. Now, I originally beat this when it first dropped on the 3DS, but I have to say, predictably, it looks a whole lot better on the Steam Deck. Now, to be fair, there are no shortage of places that you can play Resident Evil Revelations at this point because it's pretty much on everything. However, I was particularly thrilled to play it again in the handheld format because that's where I played it for the first time, so again, it felt really nice to dive back into it in the handheld format that, again, was the way I first experienced Resident Evil Revelations. And yeah, I suppose if you wanted that handheld experience, you could play the Switch port of it, although I have a sneaking suspicion that it performs a little bit better here. And I really do mean a little bit better, because while my time with it was pretty smooth for the most part, I would notice occasional frame rate hitches, not true drops to anything that would be abysmal or anything like that, but at certain points when I was loading into a new area or opening a door, I would see the frame rate take a temporary dive and then pick back up. It was not an issue just exploring and clearing rooms on this creepy, dilapidated ghost ship that is infested with zombies or anything like that, but you'll definitely notice it, and I assume that this is part of the reason why it's not listed as a true verified title on the deck yet. And one of the things that I did to try to get around this was to drop the refresh rate down to 40 and in turn also cap the frame rate at 40. And it might have been my imagination, but that did seem to help a little bit. But regardless, it still felt pretty solid when I was playing it. And like Resident Evil 4, if you're somebody who prefers the over-the-shoulder style of Resident Evil games, Revelations definitely delivers. However, I should point out that it is a game that's broken up into an episodic and sub-episodic format, which some people are going to enjoy, some people are not going to enjoy that much. Personally, I really liked it, and I think it probably made a lot of sense when they were targeting the handheld format of the 3DS, and I still think it holds up as a design choice for the Steam Deck, which is also portable. Not quite as portable or pocketable as a 3DS, but you know what I mean. If you're also one of those people who appreciates the handheld, more intimate horror experience that you can play before bed to make sure that you have nightmares, Resident Evil Revelations is great for that. But if you're looking for something that is less linear and less horror and more massive open world and more heroic, look no further than Batman Arkham City. Now, right out of the gate, Arkham City is a verified title on the deck, and I believe Arkham Asylum is as well. When it comes to Arkham Knight, I don't think that is a verified title, although I've played it and it seems to run pretty well. But one of the things I thought was weird about Arkham City is, despite the fact that it is a verified title, I could not get it to launch initially. And after doing a little bit of research, what I found was you actually have to go into the settings, like the PC game settings, before you actually launch the game proper, and tell it not to play in full screen mode, but rather to play in windowed mode. And I thought that was a really good example of what I mentioned in previous videos when I'd said that, you know, even out of the box, you know, it can be kind of a buggy, tricky experience on the Steam Deck at times. Like no matter what, you're going to have to do some tinkering with this device, and I feel like this was a really prime example of that. Now, after you set it to windowed mode instead of full screen, it will launch totally fine and at a perfectly smooth 60 frames per second, but again, I do think it was a really good example of when I mentioned that, you know, you are going to have to do some tinkering with the Steam Deck pretty much no matter what, even with the titles that are verified on deck from time to time. This is what I was talking about. Alright, with that small technical hiccup out of the way, let's just talk about the game itself, and Arkham City is amazing because it took everything that was great about Arkham Asylum and then just expanded it exponentially. Now, even though I would say the Spider-Man games in the modern era just kind of take the top spot for what a superhero game can be, I would also say that Peter and Miles kind of stand on the shoulders of Bruce Wayne in the Arkham series for really raising the bar in terms of what we could come to expect from a superhero game. It's not as graphically flashy as Arkham Knight, although that runs pretty great on the deck as well, but it's still my favorite in the series to return to, and diving back in on the Steam Deck is an absolute joy. Now I remember when Blackgate came out on the Vita, and actually now that I think about it, that is also a verified title on the Steam Deck, but when it first came out on the Vita, I really wished I could just play a full-blown Arkham experience in the handheld format, and now you totally can on the Steam Deck. Now to be fair, it's rumored that the Arkham games are going to be coming to the Switch later this year or maybe next year, but I suspect you will have a better and probably prettier experience playing through them again on the Steam Deck. Plus I do think that right now is a really good time to revisit any of the Arkham games because we do have Gotham Knights coming out later this year. And my final entry on this list is another open world game, though perhaps not in a genre you would commonly associate with it, and that would be Need for Speed Most Wanted. Not the original that I think came out around 2005, but rather this is the 2012 version, which, to be fair, when it came out, I completely ignored. And I ignored it like an idiot because I thought the cover looked really boring. And I shouldn't have, because that was made by Criterion, the same people who brought us the Burnout games, which I absolutely loved. And predictably, like a lot of other games that are 10 years old at this point, it has no problem at all maintaining a solid 60 frame rate. And what I did not expect, again because I just completely passed on this game the first go-around, was just how much of Burnout's DNA is woven into the arcadey Need for Speed experience. In addition to the regular point-to-point races, or circuit races, or just evading the cops that you would expect from a Need for Speed title, it also has a fair amount of the same kind of action and NOS-boosting activities that you would do in a Burnout game layered within. And it has no shortage of things that you would expect from either of those series, whether that's car customization, evading the cops, or just running around this gigantic open city and finding a range of unlockables and fun activities that you can take part in. My only complaint so far after diving in is that sometimes I feel like the cops are a little bit too aggressive, and also I hate that whenever I do crash, which admittedly is more than I'd like, I don't like having to wait so long for the slow motion crash animation to finish or anything. I really just want to get back into the action faster. Now to be fair, whenever they reset your car, they do kind of ramp you up to like 50 or 60 miles an hour. You're not just going from a dead stop or anything in most cases, but still, it's just little things like that, especially for a game that is completely centered around speed, like you would expect from a Need for Speed. It is a little bit jarring, but ultimately, those light criticisms aside, it still runs really great on the deck, and if you're a fan of arcade racers, you should definitely not pass on this the way I did 10 years ago, because it runs great, and in turn, of course, you'll enjoy the benefits of longer battery life and pretty rock-solid performance. Now with this list, I try to provide a pretty decent mix of genres, but again, the Steam Deck is just incredible for old games, not just because of the battery life advantages, but really just because it has this magical way of consolidating years and years of games into a single platform and just making them accessible at the drop of a hat. I think that's one of my favorite things about the Steam Deck, period. So periodically I'm probably going to continue to just explore older games and probably make future videos about it, but hey, what about you? Do you have any suggestions for old games I should test or try out on the Steam Deck? If so, please let me know in the comments below so I can work it into a future video at some point, because again, I do my best to read and reply to every comment below. But as always, have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, depending on when you're watching this. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to watch the video. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye.